Have you ever had a hankering to watch a movie about a killer laundry press machine that comes to life and starts killing people? Well, I've got you covered. Uncle Woodsman is going to sort you out today. Hi guys, so before we get into it, a very quick disclaimer that you'll find all my other reviews of Stephen King adaptations in my Stephen King playlist, and there will be spoilers today. This movie is almost 30 years old, although I don't remember it coming out at the time. I don't think Barry Norman covered the Mangler on his TV review show that he used to have. My guess is that the BBC just quietly persuaded him to let this one slip through the cracks without covering it. But as it was with Graveyard Shift, which I covered the other week, the Mangler originates from Stephen King's Night Shift collection, and having now done some more research into what films sprang up from Night Shift, let me tell you, we are going to be stuck on that particular short story collection for quite some time in this review series. But I was amazed when I found out that they made a full-length movie out of this, because if you'd have asked me beforehand, I would have said, okay, well, maybe the Mangler could make a good 20 to 25 minutes short as part of an anthology, but to make an entire movie out of it, I mean, there's just not that much material in the original short story. So just to give you an idea of it, in the original, there's this possessed laundry machine which is stuck to the spot in this factory, and it starts killing people. It starts killing the workers. Anybody who leans in too close or sticks their hand in for whatever reason, it will then pull that person in and crush them to death in a really nasty way. And I think it does this a couple of times, and then a cop gets involved and starts investigating along with a university scholar. That they start working together, and they eventually come up with some kind of spell that they can use to exorcise the demon that's living in the laundry press machine. But it kind of goes wrong for some reason. I can't remember why, but the story finishes with the laundry machine thing getting loose and bouncing off down the street. It's a very silly way for the story to end, but because it's a short, it kind of doesn't matter. But in order to make this a full-length film, they've added in a few more characters and subplots, and some of these additions are kind of cool, others not so much, but we'll come to that stuff shortly. This was directed by Tobe Hooper, so I was kind of killing two birds with one stone with this review. It was a chance for me to add one more Stephen King review to my playlist, but at the same time, it just pushes me one step closer to having seen all of Tobe Hooper's movies, and I don't think I've got that many left now. I think Life Force is very much on my mind as something I'd like to see soon, but after that, there's not an awful lot left for me and Hooper. In terms of actors in this, there are two well-known names that you'll recognise most likely. One of them is Robert Englund, who plays the manager of the laundromat factory, if that's what you want to call it. I'm not a massive fan of Nightmare on Elm Street, so I'm not somebody who goes weak at the knees every time I see Englund pop up in something. And I've got to say, his role here is probably one of the biggest misfires in the Mangler, because they've got Englund. They've tried to make this laundromat owner excessively creepy and horrible. They've aged him up a little bit like Doc Brown in Back to the Future, and they've given him robot legs, and he leers at his secretary, and he's just generally mean-spirited to everybody, and I just didn't get a lot out of this character. I just don't think what they were going for works at all. Plus, his role in the movie kind of confuses me. I didn't really understand his relationships to the various women in the factory. I looked up the plot for this film after I'd watched it, and I was sat there like, oh right, so he was the lover of that woman, and he was the father of that woman. I didn't understand what was going on with the laundromat manager at all when I was actually watching the movie. Much more successful, though, is Ted Levine as the cop investigating the deaths. He's the main character in the whole thing. Now, Ted Levine is mainly famous for playing Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, and when I saw him in this, I thought to myself, oh wow, it's that guy from Silence of the Lambs, and I figured that this was probably the first time I'd seen him in anything since that movie. But when I looked at his filmography afterwards, I realised that actually I've seen about 8 films with Ted Levine in. I've just never recognised him before. But I think the reason I recognised him in this is because the Mangler only came out about 3 or 4 years after Silence of the Lambs, so he still kind of looks like Buffalo Bill here, albeit with a different haircut, whereas all those countless other movies I would have seen him in, he would have aged so much that I just wouldn't have recognised him. But he's quite good in this, well, at least once he gets going. I wasn't massively convinced by the casting to begin with. It was just so weird seeing Ted Levine play somebody who is not a transsexual killer, but even though it does feel like a casting that's a little bit like a square peg into a round hole, he really puts a lot of effort in on this film. And once we got like 20 to 30 minutes in, I found myself completely on his side, egging him on and hoping he was going to get to the bottom of this whole thing. The problem with the concept of the Mangler is that the thing is literally glued to the same spot. So there's a very easy way to survive it. Just don't go anywhere near it. Once one person has died in this story, there's really no need for anybody else to die. I mean, it's not like accidents in these sorts of environments can't happen. I've witnessed something myself, actually. Let me clarify that. I haven't actually seen with my own eyes somebody die in machinery, but I was out in a nightclub this one time when I was in my sort of late 20s, and I bumped into this kid that I knew at school, except he was a lot older now, obviously, and he had 2 fingers missing, and I was like, oh God, what happened to you? And it turns out he'd stuck like a couple of his fingers in this machine at work, and he'd got some compensation for it, and he was getting on with his life. But, you know, bad things can happen in factories, but it's one thing to lose a couple of digits. It's another thing to get pulled in completely and start getting crushed by some completely insane machine. Although, you know, the Mangler is possessed. This is a story which is living in a sort of fantasy world. But if this was real life, the events that are happening in this film, you know, the machine would be closed down. It would be cordoned off. Health and safety inspectors would come in and they would have to spend months going over every cog to make sure that they can safely declare the machine safe for use. But in this story, the machine is literally back up and running again the very next day after it's just mangled somebody, and you've got all these employees going straight back to work, having to stick their hands in and around the machine, knowing full well that one of their colleagues is lying in the morgue somewhere. But I'll give Tobe Hooper some credit. He's tried to inject some variety into this whole thing. This film is not just somebody dying in pretty much the same way every sort of 10 or 15 minutes because people just have to keep on working for a living. You know, at one point somebody has got their arm stuck and the machine's dragging them in, and someone else chops their arm off with like a fire axe. And there's another scene where the cop gets his coat snagged in the thing and he's got to shoot his coat off with his gun. So different things are happening in and around the Mangler. And at the end, you get this crazy situation where, due to a failed spell, the Mangler is able to suddenly move and it's running around like the Terminator. But I didn't like this closer to the movie. I mean, on the one hand, it is copying what happens in the short story, because in the short, the machine does get out, but then the story ends. There's no big chase, no big battle. But here, they've really gone over the top. They've got this machine, this like CGI'd machine running around after these people, and it looks absolutely awful. Honestly, they should have just ended the film with the cop casting some kind of spell, and that banishes the demon. The end. I mean, that would have been a little bit underwhelming for some people, but at least that would have closed the book on a relatively enjoyable half detective noir, half horror film, and then, you know, it can just end at 90 minutes instead of making it like 106, which I believe is what they've done. But this main cop character, he's a little bit cliche, let me say that. He's a typical sort of 80s, 90s anti-hero cop with a trench coat. He's always got a cigarette in his mouth. He's clearly damaged from years on the job. He doesn't have a wife. I mean, how many times have we seen a guy like this in movies? But back when The Mangler came out, it was almost expected that a character would be like this in a film like this. But it just seems a little bit cheesy now. But there's definitely a noir feel to this film. The whole universe where the story is taking place, it feels a little bit like Gotham to me. You've got like reporters with ridiculously oversized cameras, and all the events in the film just never feel like they're happening in the real world. There's only the laundromat factory that we see and the cop's house, and that's almost it. There's one point where the cop drives past the house of somebody who's died in a different manner to the other people dying at the hands of the machine. And yeah, he just happens to be going past the front garden of this accident while the ambulance is there, and that just shows you how small scale this world is and how insular it all feels. One big positive is the side characters. So this cop, John Hunton, he's got to work together with his brother-in-law Mark. Not that there's any women floating around in this situation, but you know what? I would have had these two guys just know each other by virtue of the fact that they live next to each other. I don't think there was any need to connect the two with some vague family ties. But the scenes with Mark and John are very funny. I loved their interplay. There's a very funny scene where they have to go and visit this woman, Sherry, to ask if she's a virgin or not, because it's genuinely part of their investigation. They need the information. But I remembered how funny this scene was from the short story, actually. Another good side character is the reporter. So this is very much a world where every time something happens in the town, it's always the same reporter turning up to cover it. He's the only person doing that job, seemingly. It's the same with the cop. You know, every time something happens, it's always the same cop turning up. There is a chief of police we briefly hear on the phone. He's just having a rant at Hunter, and he's saying something like, if you don't book up your ideas, you're going to be on traffic duty for a month. You know, something like that. Typical cliched, angry chief character. But this reporter, I like the implied history between him and Hunton. And it's really sad, actually, when we realise that the reporter is going to die. There's some real pathos in those scenes. I also like a side plot involving an air conditioning unit, or is it a fridge? Let's call it a fridge, for ease of reference. So near the beginning, this fridge thing that people are carrying in the laundromat, it accidentally brushes against the Mangler, and from then on, it's infested with whatever the Mangler's got, and this thing ends up at some house somewhere else in town, and it kills a kid, because the kid gets in it, and the door slams shut, and the kid suffocates to death. Very, very sad. But I just like the idea that the Mangler can turn inanimate objects into being just like itself, if you see what I mean. And actually, I think they should have brought this fridge object back for the end of the movie, because the stinger we get instead is really unsatisfying. So Hunton comes back to the laundromat sometime later and discovers that the Mangler is back where it started, and it's completely healed up again and just acting as part of the factory, but it got destroyed down in the sewer. So what on earth is going on here? I think the implication is like, ooh, look, it's back and it's going to carry on doing what it's doing. But I think they should have brought the fridge object back. I think we should have gone to the local dump or something and seen the fridge kill one last person before the credits roll. And then that could have been a little suggestion that maybe it will be the fridge who takes over in the Mangler 2, because there are 2 sequels to this film. It's bonkers. There's a frigging trilogy of the Mangler. They literally made 2 more, and I haven't looked into what's actually in those movies yet. I'm still coming to terms with the fact that they exist. Okay, so I think we've reached that point where I show you my copy of the movie, but I don't own the Mangler. I rented this on Amazon Prime the other night. I think it cost me £3.49, I think, and I guess we will call that reasonable value for the film that I got. Right, shall we get to the bag of terror and find out how I'm going to score this? I think we should. So we've got 1, 2, 3 bloody axes out of 5. A reasonable evening's entertainment, I suppose, although I've got to say I'm unlikely to ever go back to it, and I'm very sceptical as to what the second and the third films will have in store for me. But that's for another day. For now, let's get to a reading update. So I've just finished reading Firestarter, really long book, but very enjoyable. I think this is the 7th King book I've completed in my read-through project, if we're allowed to count Night Shift. And this one would be up near the top somewhere for me. I really enjoyed it. It's about this girl who can create fire due to some failed government experiment involving her parents. So kind of similar to Carrie, except instead of having a girl who can do telekinesis, we've got a girl who can do pyrokinesis. Stephen King loves characters who've got special abilities, I suppose. Cracking villain in this called John Rainbird, one scary dude. Yeah, I thought it was great. I had a really good time reading this book, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what the movie adaptation is like, although it's not a particularly famous film, is it? So I'm kind of wondering whether they cocked it up a little bit for this one. But we'll see when I eventually get there. But for now, I'm taking a little break from Stephen King and going back to the world of Alien. I've just bought Alien Resurrection, a digital version. You can only really buy second-hand copies of Alien Resurrection for some reason. And they're a bit more pricey than what I paid for the novelizations of the first 3 films. So this one I'm just going to read on my phone. So I'll see how I get on with that. Although I'm not predicting that this is going to be a good ride. I'm not the biggest fan of the Resurrection movie. Let's just say that. Right, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you for joining me for my review of The Mangler, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.